Chair, I also want to digress from my notes for 5 minutes, or for 1 minute, but wow, the difference in language from the MPs on this panel tonight compared to last year is incredible. Last year it felt like only Rosie and Tonya had the guts to talk about what we knew as women about women's sex-based rights. So Jess and Diane, thank you. Thank you for listening to women and moving with us. And everybody here, the women here, ordinary women who have for years worked to make this change happen. Here's to us. Right. Back to where I was supposed to be.
Oh, sorry, I'm interjecting though.
All right.
Diana was there last year as well.
She was, but she didn't. There's been a change in the language. There absolutely has. Anyway, back to speech. In the last year, since we met last year, 2,186 women and girls in England and Wales every day have been subjected to sexual assault, but less than 2 in 100 rapes recorded by the police in 2022 resulted in a charge, let alone a conviction. In the last year, an estimated 1,006,071 women in England and Wales were subject to domestic violence and abuse. And in the last year, we can name at least 110 women and girls aged over 14 who've been killed by men. The average of one woman in the UK killed by a man every 3 days has been constant and consistent in the 15 years that the femicide census has been recording these killings. And it's not an either-or for many women. The reality of women's lives is that many cross boundaries between forms of sexual and domestic violence and abuse. The crime figures that we know are the tip of the iceberg of men's violence against and abuse of women and girls. There are countless other crimes, microaggressions, and behaviours which don't meet crime standards, crime thresholds, but do negatively affect, restrict, and reduce lives of women and girls. So how do we consign this everyday normal of men's abuse of females to history? Top of the list, I'm going to put that we need to see the connections between all forms of men's violence against women and girls, rape and other forms of sexual violence, intimate partner violence and abuse, coercive control, prostitution, FGM, pornography, sexual harassment. We need to put them all together to be able to identify the roots. This is necessary for meaningful social change. Seeing these connections is an absolutely critical step in ending men's violence against women, but it's an early step and it's a very, very long road, and there are constantly pushbacks, sometimes dressed up as progression. In 2010, the then coalition government launched its strategy, the Call to End Violence Against Women and Girls. That strategy has been revised twice, but just over a decade later, under the Conservative government, and after many years in the making, we see the creation of the Domestic Abuse Act. And in this, the concept of the connections between the different forms of men's violence against women and girls is overshadowed by a so-called landmark piece of legislation that crosses the sexes. A significant minority of us believe that this was an opportunity missed, and what we would have chosen instead was a Men's Violence Against Women Act. So whilst it's good that concepts that were once only understood by feminists have become mainstream, the problem is that when this happens, the feminist foundations of those concepts are usually washed out by the time they become policy, and this renders them much less effective. Another thing, and I know Jess has already said this, but I'm not going to miss saying it again, is that we can't shy away from naming the agent men. Man singular and men plural as perpetrators. Men as a sex class of beneficiaries, and patriarchy as a social order which is shaped and reproduces itself in men's interests. It should be inconceivable that one of the significant barriers that we've had to address, an issue that has taken up inordinate amounts of feminist time and energy, is being able to say what a woman is and what a man is, and yet that's the story of the last decade. If we cannot measure sex in data, we cannot measure sex differences, we cannot measure sex inequality, and we cannot measure who does what to whom across the forms of sexual and domestic violence and abuse. Without the ability to do this, policy interventions will inevitably be arrows shot in the dark. It took a grassroots, crowd-funded judicial review led by Fair Play for Women for the ONS to agree to define the sex question in the 2021 England and Wales census on the basis of sex, not gender identity. It took women's direct action. It took women's money. It took women standing together and saying no. It should be to any legislator's shame that that was necessary. The government spends millions on responding to men's violence against women and girls, amounts that the feminists who began building the network of women's refuges and rape crisis services just over 50 years ago would not have dared to dream of. So why are we not seeing the evidence that men's violence against women is reducing? The main reason, in my opinion, is that most interventions focus on individuals who are violent and institutions that respond to that violence, and a bit of mealy-mouthed nod to prevention, something that they call healthy relationships every now and again. These interventions have largely been taken out of their feminist framework. While perpetrators must, of course, be held responsible for their actions and behaviours, men's violence against women is not simply reducible to individual acts perpetrated by individual men. It is key to men's domination of women, and it is supported and normalised by patriarchal institutions, attitudes, and social norms and values. There's a high degree of negative correlation between sex equality and rates of men's violence against women. That is, as equality increases, violence against women decreases. Cultural concepts of masculinity and femininity need to be got shut of, certainly not embedded in the way that they are in transgender identity ideology. The objectification of women and the sexualisation of that objectification needs to end. It's long overdue for Labour to have a policy position on ending prostitution. Sex equality is not possible when one sex is for sale, when women are a commodity and the other sex is the vendor and the buyer, with consumer rights, of course. We need not only to hold men to account, we need not only to ensure that policing, the law, the budget, education systems are not sexist and misogynistic by design. We must also address the factors in an individual which create violence. We must eradicate sex inequality, and we must absolutely uproot the social and cultural context that supports men's violence against women. So this takes us back to my first point, making the connections across different forms of men's violence against women. If we want to end that violence, we need responses that acknowledge that whilst either sex can be victim or perpetrator, in most crimes in patriarchal societies, violent crimes reflect sex inequality and patriarchal cultural values. Different forms of violence share root causes, and creating silos around those different forms of violence, which disregard sex, moves us away from seeing and addressing the root causes. So what does Labour need to do? Labour needs to listen to feminists. Labour needs to stop watering down our insights in an effort to appease the what about the men's, the defensive men, the men who think women's sex-based rights and protections are not a foreground issue for the party, the men who think that the concept of patriarchy is a feminist conspiracy theory, the men who think that men can be women, or who are afraid to say that they know that women cannot and do not have a penis. But first, Labour needs to get elected. So Labour needs to let women know that our voices are heard and that our needs and rights are prioritised if it wants to count our votes.